Hi, welcome to Culturally Determined on Blogging Heads TV. I'm your host, Aryeh Cohen-Wade. My guest today is Phoebe Maltz Bovy. She really doesn't need an introduction for Blogging Heads regulars, but I will ask her to introduce herself anyway.
Sure, that's right. Thank you, Aryeh. I do with Kat and I do the Feminine Chaos program on Blogging Heads as well. But so what can I say about myself? I wrote The Perils of Privilege, a book that came out in 2017, and discussed it actually with Aryeh on different Blogging Heads. And I also, sort of my other career thing is I have a PhD in French and French studies from NYU, and my dissertation was on 19th century French Jewish history. So that's sort of what brings me here today, is to talk about that. I don't really do much to do with that these days, that topic, but it follows all of us everywhere.
Right. So the thing we're mainly going to be talking about is, we have a couple topics. So the first topic is going to be the Dreyfus Affair, which you are an expert in. And the next topic will be much more lighthearted, I expect, which is Seinfeld, the TV show Seinfeld. You mentioned in an episode a couple weeks ago of your show, Feminine Chaos, that you strongly identified with the character George.
For sure.
And I think me and at least one commenter were surprised by that and thought
Really?
like, wow, that's interesting. And Seinfeld was a big part of my life when I was a teenager. So I wanted to talk about that. And then maybe if we still have time, we'll talk about being canceled, being uncanceled, being self-canceled, being canceled and not actually being canceled, and stuff like that. But okay, so let's start with the Dreyfus Affair. And we kind of, like, you and I have just, like, I think you have discussed this before. Maybe I've read your writing about it and knew you had expertise in it. And I know a little bit about it. Probably some people have heard what it is and don't know the details at all. And so we're going to talk about this historical event and its contemporary resonances. So for people who have never heard of it before, what is the Dreyfus Affair?
Oh, sure. So this is going to be a special for any commenter who wants to really hear me hold forth, a special occasion for that. So the Dreyfus Affair is the description given to the controversy surrounding the false accusation, the unjust accusation of treason against French Jewish army officer Alfred Dreyfus. The affair itself, the dates generally given 1894 to 1906, starting from when Dreyfus was arrested and ending when he was exonerated. Alfred Dreyfus went on to serve again in the French military, served in World War I. And this whole episode, as the historian the French historian Pierre Birnbaum has written, and I think it's just kind of generally understood, it's a very bleak moment in a lot of ways in French Jewish history, but it's also weirdly perhaps seen as kind of among French Jews as a kind of positive, or at least it was for a time, as a sort of positive episode, because it was a time when, because basically Dreyfus won. The sort of the left, broadly speaking, and a lot of the center in France ended up supporting Dreyfus and opposing anti-Semitism. And this event, I mean, there's so much about it we're going to be talking about, so I'll try not to try to cover everything in like one, spoken paragraph here. Mm-hmm. But basically, because of the Dreyfus Affair, that's kind of why the left in France didn't go a really anti-Semitic route that it kind of had been going up till then to some extent. So the Dreyfus Affair was terrible for Alfred Dreyfus personally, who was sent to Devil's Island and not having obviously a great time of it. But it's compared certainly to the sort of more famous, notorious, better known, event of French Jewish history, namely the Holocaust in France. Obviously, the Dreyfus Affair is both seeming like not such a big deal, but also it was a story about anti-Semitism, but anti-Semitism kind of overcome.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the shortest I can do on the Dreyfus.
Okay, yeah. So what was the precipitating event that led to him being charged?
Okay. So the precipitating event, to understand kind of the context of it, basically the Dreyfus family, which we will be talking about again when we get to Seinfeld because of Julia Louis-Dreyfus being from apparently the same family.
You're giving away the transition, the segue I had meticulously prepared. No, I'm joking.
The script I'm reading from this. No. Basically they were Jews from, like, Alsatian Jews. So from this region that's this border region between France and Germany that sometimes in history has belonged to France, sometimes to Germany, right? So in the Franco-Prussian War, a lot of Jewish families from that region opted to be French rather than German. These were Jews who were Ashkenazi and had like sort of somewhat Germanic culture, right? So they were perceived of, they faced not just anti-Semitism in France, but also kind of anti-German sentiment as well. So basically, somebody was selling secrets to the Germans in the 1890s when this was a big deal, and when there was just still a lot of tension between France and Germany. And there was this document, and I feel like there's a name for it in English, but whatever. Isn't it the Bordeaux? Anyway, whatever. The point is there's a document that where Dreyfus was accused of having sold these secrets, right? And supposed to be his handwriting, but then they found other handwriting. It wasn't really his handwriting. But anyway, the forgery, was a lot of drama. That aspect of it, I'm like, I would need more notes to get every detail about it. But basically, the precipitating event was kind of the Franco-Prussian War, even though that was earlier. But then the precipitating event itself was this secrets having been sold to the Germans situation. And then Dreyfus being arrested. And then you were probably going for Zola, maybe.
Well okay, so there was a document that seemed to implicate Dreyfus as the person passing secrets to the enemy Germans. And so then why? Okay, so was this like? So I guess one of the few things I know about the Dreyfus Affair is that it was a cause célèbre, and maybe it was like the first cause célèbre.
Oh boy.
So did that? How long did it take?
I will plead sleeplessness or lack of sleep, whatever, and say yes. The precipitating event for the Dreyfus Affair was really the French novelist and public intellectual Émile Zola. And first, a little side note: everybody should read his novel, The Lady's Paradise is what it's called in English. It's really, really good. He's written as if he's like still alive. He's like sitting here next to me. He wrote many, many novels, some of which aren't great, but that one I think is.
Is he the one who wrote this like a kind of loosely interconnected 50 novels or something?
Ron Macquart novels where it's like this family tree. It's naturalist literature, and where he did all this research and had these, obviously not really the cutting edge of science for today, but these notions about genetics and all of this. But basically, he also was a public intellectual who had written, for his day, very progressive things about Jews already, including even in his fiction. Although sometimes, it would all be super problematic by today's standards, I'm sure. Well, I'm not just guessing at this, like I know what these novels are. The novel L'Argent, Money, I think, would probably, a sensitivity reader would find one or two things to pick up on. But anyway, he saw this injustice and wrote this article, the front page of on the front page of a French newspaper, and the article was called "J'accuse," I accuse, and accused everybody in authority of mishandling this case. This, in turn, got people interested. So there had been a Dreyfus case for a few years there before there was a Dreyfus Affair.
Okay.
So that's what turned it into a thing.
Okay, so yeah, okay, that makes sense. And so did it become clear to the unbiased observer, although maybe there couldn't have been such a person, that Dreyfus was innocent and was being railroaded? Or was it like evidence on both sides and people are like fighting it out?
Well, so eventually more people became convinced of his innocence. But part of the issue was that the way this case split French public opinion, so that's what it's famous for, basically, that it split French public opinion. It wasn't always along obvious lines. So in one sense, like there were people who thought that Dreyfus was innocent, but that there were bigger truths than that. Not bigger truths even, just like bigger issues than that. And that it was more important to stick up for the church and the army as institutions than to worry about Dreyfus. On the other hand, on the left, it was not a sort of, and this is, I think, the most interesting aspect of this. And I feel like this is something I learned in a course I took, like possibly even as an undergrad, and I'm still kind of obsessed with this because it's so interesting. Basically, it was not a given on the left that Dreyfus should be supported because basically the left was at the time, we still have these sorts of debates today, and this is about getting a little at the contemporary relevance, but Alfred Dreyfus was a bourgeois man, right? The fact that he was a man was not the issue then, but he was from a bourgeois family. He was well off, and the left was about the proletariat, the underdog, and it was not self-evident, that's the word I've been looking for, on the left, that they should bother themselves with anti-Semitism, because wasn't that like identity politics? I mean, they wouldn't have said it like that, obviously, but effectively it was that it wasn't clear that this was something the left should even get involved in. And it was only when the socialist leader, Jean Jaurès, got involved that the left came around to this. So it wasn't so much about like making it clear that Dreyfus hadn't done what he was accused of. It was also just this notion of that he was that this was something worth thinking about and dealing with.
Mm-hmm. So he was first time he was convicted, and then he was he immediately exiled to this place, Devil's Island?
Right. Not like I don't remember exactly the timeline of this, but so he was arrested, then he goes to Devil's Island, then he's pardoned, and then exonerated. So these were different steps. But basically, another sort of important thing about the Dreyfus Affair is that, like, not a whole lot, and we'll get to this, I guess, when we're talking about the contemporary significance, but, like, not much happened. Like, this was one man got arrested. There were, especially in Algeria, some anti-Jewish riots. But in general, this was not, it was one of these things where it was very symbolically important. Mm-hmm. But in terms of like day-to-day life, it was not huge, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And it's, like, it's interesting to think like how many court cases from over 100 years ago do we like have any contemporary resonance at all?
Exactly.
Like maybe like, I don't know, like Oscar Wilde's like court case or something. Like I just nothing's like coming to me that's the same. So it is very strange, and it was this one guy. So then how did he end up getting pardoned and exonerated?
I don't remember the details of that aspect. Like, I mean, it was basically just that more and more people got involved, with Zola and other French intellectuals really leading the way. I don't remember the exact steps of this.
And was the like document shown to be forged, or was it just like they were misunderstanding?
I think so. I thought I was going to have a little more time to.
That's okay.
No, but I mean, I think what really, in terms of just like the significance of it, the things I would want people who didn't, waste a lot of their 20s studying this to know about is like there was so much anti-Judaism. It was, I guess it's anachronistic to call it anti-Semitism because it was before the 1880s, but they're in like 1840s France, like in the early mid 19th century in France. So in terms of how people understand this, like in North America, in the States, it's generally like, well, there was the Holocaust. That was when there was this European anti-Semitism, and who knows what happened before that. But in France, basically, there was socialism and anti-Semitism were like deeply, deeply intertwined. Not always, not all socialists would have been anti-Semitic, but like these things were not separate. Like this notion of the Jewish banker, the Rothschilds, all of this, that was just kind of part of the left, really, like until the Dreyfus Affair. And obviously has kind of stuck around in parts of the left to this day all over the world, but it's not in the same way. And just in terms of why the Dreyfus Affair stuck around, though, part of it has to do with like the history of Zionism and like why there's a state of Israel and the false, apparently, understanding that there is a state of Israel because Theodor Herzl, covering the Dreyfus Affair for the Austrian press, like wrote about, and he did write about it, but it seems like there was a little more to it than that.
Oh, okay. I didn't even know that fact, but I get that's like popularly misunderstood that Herzl was directly inspired. Herzl, father of Zionism, was directly inspired by this case. So what did you specifically do your dissertation on, and how did the Dreyfus Affair relate to that?
So the Dreyfus Affair is what I thought I would go to grad school to study, and it's one of these things that's like both really obscure and really not obscure, I guess, because it's like one of these things that's just been written about a ton. It seemed obscure to me as an undergrad, so I did not end up writing specifically about the Dreyfus Affair, but what I wrote about did kind of end up involving it. So basically, I wrote about the title, I think it was Jews and Intermarriage in 19th century France. So I wrote about Jews and Catholics marrying also, but like more the idea of these marriages, because there were not very many of them actually happening. Pretty much from the French Revolution, when these marriages became a legal possibility because they weren't prior to civil marriage legally possible. So that's the French Revolution. So like 1789 and shortly after is when Jews were emancipated in France, when they became French citizens, and when civil marriage became possible. So I cover that period to basically, like around the time of the Dreyfus Affair. So the Dreyfus Affair enters into this in terms of a real shift in the discourse on this topic. So basically, at first, the mainstream French view was very much, in theory, that there should be more of these marriages because that would kind of dilute the Jewish population out of France and is sort of assimilationist idea, right? But then what happened during the Dreyfus Affair and around that time, and also a little bit before that too, was the more sort of dominant mainstream view was that that Jews had become sort of too assimilated and were this sneaky, sinister, sort of obviously mainstream anti-Semitic view. These things were not always so separate. Were this kind of sneaky presence in France, and that intermarriage was sort of the cliche switched from being that of a beautiful, exotic Jewish woman, sort of whose oppressive father is preventing her from marrying the gallant prince, to being the hideous but rich Jewish banker's daughter who an impoverished Catholic noble has to marry because his family has no money, basically. So the cliche, I'm sorry, these are all cliches. In reality, people were marrying the same people they would have married like hundreds of years before, and there just wasn't a ton of actual intermarriage. So, yeah.
Should we jump to the contemporary residence part? Is there anything else you want to say about the historical part?
About the historical part, no. I mean, I have in my notes historiographic debate. I think we'll pass on that, even though I could, but I won't. So the contemporary relevance, I mean, the obvious is like you were saying about like the j'accuse, where you see these references to it all the time, certainly if you're looking for it, where, you know, or anytime something's called the such and such affair in that sense. But I would say I've thought about it in terms of just like various news stories recently in which effectively nothing happens. And the temptation is to say or to comment or whatever, like, why are we talking about this when in whichever country that week, you know, thousands of people are being killed or dying from some sort of natural disaster? You know, why are we talking about this nonsense, dramatic news story when there's so much else in the world? And I guess it's not so much that the Dreyfus Affair is the reason we should talk about the nonsense, but it's just to say that it's not new, and that these kind of are how intellectual debates take place. There often are these fraught things. So one that came up was that Covington story, where these students from a Catholic high school were in DC, and one of them smirked.
Yeah, most people probably remember this. It was only like 2 months ago, I think.
It feels now very. I'm like trying to remember. Like I know there was
a Native American
activist also.
Yeah, the initial thing that went viral was this video of a young man, teenager, in a red "Make America Great Again" hat, having some sort of staring at a Native American activist who's like banging a little drum and the young man is seemingly smirking. And then other videos came out that complicated the picture of what happened on the ground, where the Native American man like entered the group of 50 or so young men from the private Catholic school, and so it seemed like kind of he initiated the confrontation. There was also this group that's called, I think, the Black Hebrew Israelites that were involved.
Right, they were
to some
involved.
extent. If we want to get the Jewish or quote unquote Jewish angle into this, but yeah, but
of course.
And it seemed to captivated social media for a very long time. There were op-eds written and editorials and reporting and what does this mean?
Right.
And it really all does seem ridiculous. Like even at the time, I thought it seemed very
somebody
stupid.
gave somebody a look was the whole thing. The most that even might have happened, in a sense, was a look.
Yeah, and why did this
and a wearing of a
infuriate
hat
so many people when so it okay, so in the Dreyfus Affair it wasn't, you could say, historic, like in the grand scheme of things it was just one man who had an injustice done to him. In the case of the Covington thing, what was on video was a like quasi confrontation in which nothing actually happened. There wasn't a punch thrown, no one was injured, but because it was recorded and like edited selectively, whether on purpose or not, it somehow made people go nutso. And then I guess the kid who was smirking or not smirking, depending on your point of view, became the Dreyfus-like figure in this because he was like ID'd or doxxed or something, and people found out who he was, and then he went on one of the like Good Morning America or one of those shows like within 72 hours, giving his side of the thing, and then his parents are suing the Washington Post and like one or two other organizations for $250 million. So that's obviously like, that's a ridiculous lawsuit. That's like they're looking for a settlement or something. I doubt they'll get that. But yeah. So is l'affaire Covington? Is this is this splitting opinion?
I think it's definitely Dreyfus-like in terms of the splitting of opinion, and also similarly, I'd say that case of, was it Jussie Smollett?
Jussie Smollett, I think, yeah.
Right, who, that whole story to do with a hate crime that maybe didn't actually happen, but I have not been following that as closely as I was, I guess, at one point following the Covington thing because it was so strange.
Yeah, in that case, it seems
like
there's a hoax involved as well.
yes.
That's the most likely thing
That's what it sounds like.
Yeah.
Basically, in both of these cases, I would say it's the same idea in terms of sort of a lot of nothing splitting public opinion. And certainly in terms of Dreyfus being a lot of nothing, yes, it was one man being, falsely accused and arrested. But I think it's also like historically, you have to think about what was about to happen with World War I, which was so huge and so momentous and so much more like between World War I and World War II, Dreyfus seemed like such nothing. You know what I mean? So it's like a similar amount of nothing relatively, maybe, if that makes sense. But I think where they're different, though, is that there isn't an obvious sort of pure victim figure at the center of it. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think the teenager is sort of a pure victim in the sense of being a teenager and like, in the sense of being, a child loosely defined. I don't know exactly. I don't remember how old.
I think he was like 17.
So, I mean, I think, if he were 18 and wearing one of those hats, I would feel absolutely okay with sharing my thoughts on those hats if people wear them. But, yeah, I think the question, and then like what's it seems like there's this pattern in a couple of these cases where first a lot of people who aren't necessarily at all on the right and often are on the left or just sort of like have a kind of progressive way of thinking about things will think, well, this doesn't seem right, even though everybody on the left is saying one thing, but this doesn't seem quite right. But then the right will jump in, the far right, Trump, up to Trump, everybody will kind of jump in and turn it into a kind of far right talking point, so like Trump got involved, right, with possibly both of these.
I think he weighed in on Twitter on both of them. Yeah.
So then it becomes this thing where like, is this really about the truth, or or do these things with social media in a very different publicity era than the 19th century? They just so quickly become so like opinions just divvy up so much more quickly. And then there's this issue, right, of evidence. It's a little different in terms of once you have video involved. Yeah, I mean, I would say it's the same in terms of the splitting of public opinion, but not quite the same in terms of there being a figure at the center of it who's so clear cut, but also not the same in terms of there being like an obvious right answer, if that makes sense. Like, and part of it has to just do with time, like you look at the Dreyfus Affair now, and I don't think anybody's saying, well, not nobody, but most people aren't going to say, well, what a shame that Alfred Dreyfus didn't get punished for the crime he didn't commit, like didn't get more punished than he already was for the crime he didn't commit. Mm-hmm. Whereas here, I don't really know that there's any sort of clear answer in that same way. Like, there's like, who is the Zola in all of this?
Well, yeah, it's interesting to think about who can one, when everyone has the opportunity to weigh in, can one person say j'accuse and who has the moral weight or whatever or the fame to do that? I mean, in a lot of cases, in these two cases, what you see a lot of the critique from the right is about the media, and the media blows this out of proportion. The young man's parents are suing the media, and then with the Smollett thing, it was like, the media wasn't skeptical enough, and they never should have believed him, and. Yeah, so there's a pre-existing bias against the media on the right anyway, so that plays into that, and they can just add it to the bill of particulars and reasons why the media is fake news and enemy of the people. And something else you mentioned when you were describing the reaction during the Dreyfus era was this idea that well, do the facts really matter when there's a larger truth at hand here? And I think that really does come into play in a lot of these instances where you have like a contested episode that everyone, everyone wants to weigh in. There's a there's the hot take market.
For sure.
There's the New York Review of Books article you can write a month later, and
which brings up another that Ian Baruma Financial Times article that everybody's obsessed with on Twitter. I quote from it: "Free speech is often claimed as a right of the powerful to abuse the weak. After all, la libre parole, the free word, was the title of one of the most ferociously anti-Semitic French journals at the time of the Dreyfus Affair." So it's everywhere. The Dreyfus Affair.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I think you're totally right, though, about this notion of these different, the bigger truths. So I think this comes up the most where I see it on the left. It comes up on the left and the right, but where I see it on the left specifically is this notion of sort of like, yes, these college students were protesting something stupid, but isn't it more important that such and such other thing? You know what I mean? So it's not necessarily that the details are being argued over, but it'll be sort of like, why are you talking about this when there's this other thing that's much bigger, if that makes sense?
Yeah, or like, okay, maybe Jussie Smollett wasn't assaulted, but violence against black men by white extremists is a problem in society. Or maybe the Catholic student wasn't smirking, dangerously at the Native American protester, but, whatever. The Native American life expectancy is 10 years shorter than white life expectancy in America, or something like that. And so there's people who like go all in on these things from the get-go. Like there were some very prominent people who went all in on defending and supporting Jussie Smollett because he is a like B-list celebrity, and so like Ava DuVernay, AOC. All posted things on Twitter that were like saying, yes, this just shows the problem is XYZ. And I don't know how many of them have kind of said like, oh, I'm sorry, I rushed to judgment.
Yeah.
Usually be more like, well, this is a chance for us to discuss the problem of violence against black men in Chicago.
Which arguably a hoax is harming also. I mean, I'm not by any means the first to say this. Like Dan Savage talked about this on his podcast. Like lots of people, I think, noticed this, that like if you fake a hate crime, you're doing damage also to the population that you're a part of. It's because then they're more scared, and then they think that the feeling. Like, I mean, I think about because I think this came up when I was working for the Forward, so this was happening all the time. There's in the news these. People were calling in to Jewish community centers, these bomb threats or something. And then it turned out to be, was it like an Israeli-American teenager who just had some kind of, was troubled in some ways?
Yes, that I think was 2017. So it was soon after Trump's inauguration. Right. There were all these bomb threats being called into Jewish, into synagogues and like Hebrew schools and stuff like that, like hundreds, I think. And I actually went to a protest in Rochester, where the mayor of the town that has like the largest Jewish population in the Rochester metro area spoke, and like other people spoke and saying like, we're not gonna, we're gonna stand in stand in the face of hate. And then like a year later is revealed it was this mentally troubled young man in Israel who was doing these things for unknown reasons. So I don't quite know what. Yeah, so I don't quite know like it was there. I don't know. It's a that's like a baffling case, but I don't know. I guess it's a reason
meaningful because it like harmed Jews, basically. That it wasn't. So the question, like, I guess the question is, what do you take away from this? And I guess, I don't have to put myself in the place of a Jewish person, being that I am Jewish myself. So I think, and I even went to mom and baby workout class at JCC in Toronto this very afternoon. But I mean, I still think about that. Like I see JCC and I think, oh, right, there was that whole thing. Oh, right, it was that, And I think the question is the way of taking like any form of bigotry seriously to sort of ignore the fact that something was a hoax. And I feel like you can't really do it like that. I think you have to consider that the person who did the hoax, you don't then jump to everything's a hoax, but I certainly don't think that that you should kind of let the person off easy who did the hoax.
Right. And so there's Yeah, so there's never going to be like a rational explanation for why this particular Israeli man did this, but yeah, so he freaked out, tens of thousands of people, and in addition, he's now provided like another little like data point for the people out there who think that like, oh, the Jews are always making things up and like trying to manipulate us, and so that's obviously an anti-Semitic belief, but there's probably people out there who don't aren't like obsessed by anti-Semitism who have that sort of belief maybe in the back of their head. And then if this, then another thing happens, like, oh yeah, well the Jews, they did it again, or whatever. And so no one got blown up, but a lot of people were freaked out, and so don't do a hoax. It's basically
don't do a hoax. Definitely, we are in full agreement. Don't do a hoax.
Anti-hoax,
whichever group you're part of.
Right, and I guess, I mean, how do you think does social media just speed this up, or like the Covington thing? If there was no cameras, there would be no Covington thing because nothing actually happened. There'd never be an article like in the next day in the Washington Post saying like a group of teens stared at a man like that. That's not a news of it. So yeah,
it might be a personal essay. No, it has the potential for a personal essay, like about, well, if you felt that the person had stared at you, you can write an essay about that, or you thought they were looking. But yeah, it wouldn't be a news story, no.
It gets into the
social media. I don't know. I think
the woman who wrote the essay about the yoga class where she saw a black woman struggling in her yoga class and imagined how bad she felt.
It is the most amazing and the most sort of like zeitgeist capturing thing to have ever happened. The white woman who saw a black woman in her yoga class and wrote about it for Exo Jane. Yeah. I've written about it probably more than it merits, but it's so amazing. I don't know.
Okay, but so how do you think social media?
The role of social media. I mean, I think it's the same as when the press itself was new, right? Like these things are sort of inconceivable without social media. I think what social media does, though, is, well, a few things. There's the fact that, and there have been articles, not by me, on this topic, that basically every thought exists on social media. So you have all these articles, like people on Twitter are outraged that such and such. So it's very hard to know, I find, because of social media, what sort of public opinion actually is, if that makes sense. And also just this sense of like, you can feel that people think a certain thing, and it's because even if you follow, like I follow, hundreds of people, not so many people, but like my sense, for example, just to give like one not at all controversial topic, like where do Jews stand on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? What I would think is the case from the people I follow on social media is not what is the case according to surveys. It's just that these are two completely different things. And then in terms of like being surprised at who won the 2016 election, like even if you're not in a bubble in the sense of everybody's always agreeing with each other, like people I follow, many of them despise one another for ideological reasons, and I'm sure for personal reasons sometimes too. But even though I don't feel like I'm in some sort of bubble, like I'm getting a warped sense, and everybody's getting a warped sense of what people really think. So I think that's maybe a lot of it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think probably no one is like, yeah, I'm in a bubble. I constructed a bubble of like-minded people, and I'm good with that. But the reality breaks through. The 2016 election. The one that I found really funny was the Democratic primary contest for governor in New York State between Cuomo and
Cynthia Nixon.
Cynthia Nixon. And
yes. Seemed like she was a shoo-in.
Yeah, I live far away from the metropole and the media class capital in Rochester, New York, and even I was like, well, I think this will maybe be kind of close, but I think like Cuomo will probably win. But I did not see a single positive tweet about Andrew Cuomo from anyone who lived within the 5 boroughs of New York City. So I was like, okay, so
right.
Cynthia Nixon will win the city, but like Cuomo has done all this stuff upstate. And like upstate will come through to him, and it's about the same population, so it'll be kind of close. So Cuomo like has the advantage, and Cuomo didn't win any one of the 5 boroughs. he like lost the Bronx like 80-20, and he lost Brooklyn like 60-40. So that's a bubble. So I thought, how many people do I follow who live in Brooklyn compared to like what percentage
Right. Well, there's
of
New
my
York,
feed is that?
and then there's. I feel like even just, I mean, so I live in Toronto, where so is all who's governor of New York is not a big deal in my day-to-day life. But I'm from New York City originally, and I think that day to day, though, I'm definitely more like exposed to the views of like 27-year-olds who live in Brooklyn than I am of like people I grew up with, because that's just how it is on Twitter, right?
Yeah.
And if I log onto Twitter more than Facebook, which I do, that's kind of how it is. And it leads to even if you're from the place in question, and probably even if I were living in New York, I mean, it would probably still be a bit like that. It definitely leads to a warped sense of things. And in terms of these controversies, certainly the video angle, I think, is huge. Just the sheer number of stories about bigotry that start in a video, sometimes really like in a great sort of truth-telling way where horrible things that used to kind of go unseen can be seen by all, and really like there can be like a genuine, useful social justice use of these sorts of technologies. There are also these more ambiguous cases where then like the full story emerges, and things weren't as clear-cut as they seemed, and it just seems like there's no way out. It seems like a few seconds of video, people just pick their sides and everybody's on one team or another about a clip of video. And like you say, there's no expectation that you backtrack and apologize for having gotten it wrong. Like it's the next thing is in the news, and then that's it.
Yeah. And, I don't I don't know if there's maybe some technological solutions. I don't know if there's going to be like a learning process for humans of like, oh, we messed up last time, and now, I actually, the Covington thing was so stupid, and so many people popped off about it, and it turned out to be about nothing whatsoever, that I think maybe that made people a little more gun shy, just to like rally to one side when there's limited facts about what actually happened. But I guess we'll have to see when the next one, what the next viral video outrage or pseudo outrage happens. Do you want to say anything else on this topic before we move to a more lighthearted topic?
No, I'm ready for something more lighthearted.
Okay. So that would be, okay, so as referred to previously, we wanted to discuss Seinfeld, and one of the four main characters was Elaine, portrayed by Julia Louis-Dreyfus. Or is it Louis, I guess, if she has...
I think it's Louis. I think it's Julia Louis-Dreyfus, because it's this Louis-Dreyfus French-Jewish family.
Right,
Yeah.
and possible relation, and you found an article that was...
Tablet looked into this.
Looking at the various famous Dreyfuses in America, whether they're related.
I have spent surprisingly a lot of time in my life thus far studying like French Jewish ancestry. I'm not personally French at all, but this is just like for another topic that it's on my list for this, but we may not get to it. A different family, a different whole drama going on. But yeah, it's one of the big like French Jewish families that she's from, which is why I find it very sort of funny to think about. I don't know what her religious affiliation is or what, but like the fact that she's at the center of the Schick's Appeal episode of Seinfeld, and yet her name is Dreyfus, is like kind of amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's like a bunch of sort of crossover. There's like, so the final episode, spoiler alert, I'm going to talk about the final.
I think it was like literally 20 years ago or more, so it's okay. I think I was a high school freshman, so I would have been 13 or 14, so that would have been like, 98 or so.
Yeah.
97, 98.
Age about, yeah. So, yeah. So that last episode where they're in jail, right? It's kind of Dreyfusy. They're, exiled. And then also, so this is something I've thought for years, that like, there's something, this is a spoiler for Proust. I have not read all 2,000 pages, but there's a lot of Dreyfus in there. But then there's this famous line where Swan, like of Swan's Way, says, like, to think that I don't have this in front of me, so it's going to be like very botched. Whatever, it's like something like, to think that I wasted all these years obsessing over a woman who wasn't even my type. And I think about this in terms of, it seemed very like George Costanza of him, because there's this scene in Seinfeld where it's some episode where George wants to get back together with Susan, his sort of on again, off again fiance. And Jerry is reminding him that he doesn't really want this because he used to complain. Jerry's reminding George that George used to complain about going up to the stairs to her apartment and being filled with a sense of dread. And George is like, no, like, I want nothing more than to be on those stairs again. And then you see him at the end of the episode. He has convinced her to take him back, and he's going up the stairs
very slowly, right?
Sense of dread, and it's like, oh. I just feel like both Proust and Seinfeld really get at these like human truths that I think, for reasons I will get into in this Seinfeld holding forth, I don't think are possible in today's artistic climate.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so I guess the reason I wanted to talk to you about this was you mentioned in a recent episode of Femme and Chaos that you identified with George Costanza. And I guess I was surprised by that, and then I was like, well, I guess that kind of shows my sexism, because I think, like, well, if Phoebe identified with someone from the Seinfeld gang, it would be with Elaine, because Elaine is a girl. But then I was
Right.
like, well, that's really stupid to think that. But I also just, I don't know you really well, or maybe even that well, but I know you a little bit. I guess I never thought you were a George Costanza type. Because
I see.
you don't seem like a George Costanza type in particular.
Thank you, I suppose. Yeah, I think it's not so much about being a George Costanza type. I don't think I come across as, hopefully, as being similar to George Costanza, certainly in terms of my day-to-day life. There's not really a whole lot of overlap there. And I hope the physical resemblance is at a minimum, because I don't particularly resemble George Costanza. But I think it's more that I think that George Costanza is kind of like in all of us, a little bit, or at least in me. Like, when he's just completely petty about something, like a couple scenes come to mind, like certainly like the thing where he says, like, he wants to have said something snappy at work, and it's like he thinks of a comeback too late. The jerk store.
Jerk store, yeah.
Yeah, things like that. Just or just kind of like, I just think of him as like this kind of, I mean, I think the Lena Dunham character in Girls, Hannah Horvath, has a lot of this too, but it gets very differently interpreted when it's a woman in that role. Mm-hmm. But just somebody who kind of has whichever like bad, selfish impulses I think everybody sometimes has, but just has no check on them, and they're just like worried about like sort of petty things to do with themselves, but they just don't sort of know to or care to set that aside. And I think everybody probably has that to some extent, but I think, that's, I mean, I could just, I'm not going to like list every Seinfeld episode and why I get where George is coming from, because some of that is just, it'd be too much of a liability. I don't know, like say, and I identified in this case when he did this and did that. But yeah, I think, I mean, so I wrote about this, I think, a little in my book too, that like George Costanza and also Basil Fawlty from Fawlty Towers are these characters of the 1970s British sitcom by John Cleese, co-written by John Cleese, where there's a hotel owner who's just like so ill-suited to that job and just like should not have any sort of customer service role. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think like they're just well, this gets at your topic about like when people are bad versus good. Like, I think Seinfeld just leans into the bad. Like, they are all kind of like, they're the opposite of like the virtue signaling on Twitter type thing. Like, they are not like owning their privilege.
They would get
like,
canceled.
Well, exactly.
Not like sitcom canceled. Like people would be like,
right.
Jerry Seinfeld, you are canceled. Like, get out of here.
Right. And separate from, like, I think this is a separate topic from, although I do want to like briefly touch on this if there's a moment, but like this is separate from like the demographics of the actors on Seinfeld. I mean, like they are like not very enlightened people. It's not that they're not bigoted by the standards of their day. They're, well, maybe except in here and there, but that's not so much it. It's more that they're just kind of misanthropes, and they lean into that. But that's kind of the point in the last episode, is that they go to jail for basically having been assholes in public. Yeah.
I think so the like all the characters and the George characters in particular have, they will say or do the thing that you think of doing, but society prevents you, or common courtesy prevents you from acting on this belief. And like on Curb Your Enthusiasm, Larry does this as well. These small things in customer service interactions in which you're treated badly, and in real life the person walks away, and in the sitcom world, you confront the person. It becomes very funny. There is that. So just to backtrack a little bit, it's like Seinfeld really was like the piece of, like, I don't know, intellectual property or whatever you want to call it, like the piece of art or whatever that like influenced me the most from like age, I don't know, like 11 to 17 probably.
Same.
And it used to air on reruns. You grew up in New York on Channel 11, like constantly. And my friends and I all watched it. We would watch the reruns. We would quote it. In my friend group, we even kind of like assumed, we were like, you're the George, you're the Jerry, you're the Kramer. We didn't have any female friends, so there was no Elaine. And you viewers at home can guess which one I was. But
I want to know, which one were you?
Okay, so I was the Jerry of the group. But I was
going to guess Jerry.
It was the least. Okay. It was more like I had a friend who was very George-like, and I had a friend who was very Kramer-like. And so it was like, well, I'll be the Jerry one.
Okay.
And so I like really imbibed it, and like my youthful self-identification came through that show. And so then it ended, and I, like most people, don't like the finale. Wasn't super funny for one thing,
right?
And I think like my wife and I rewatched it last year because she had never seen some of the episodes, and we watched it from the beginning, and I think it really does hold up in the way that probably not a lot of other pieces of pop culture ephemera hold up. Like, there's some parts that are like 20 years later they wouldn't do it because it's like racially offensive or something. They burned a Puerto Rican flag in one episode.
Well, that episode they, I think, don't show on reruns because it is like this sort of.
Yes, like, that was the one episode they took out of syndication, but it is on. I can't remember if it's Hulu or Netflix where we watched it, but it's on there, so you can see that episode. It's actually the second to last episode.
Not in Canada.
Oh, really?
Not just that episode. It's not like Canada vetoed that episode. Like we don't have.
You can't get the full run of Seinfeld on a streaming service.
I have it on DVDs, not all of it, but some. Yeah, not that episode, I think, but just
Yeah, so I think it holds up. It is still very funny, and really like the performances are like really incredible.
Yeah.
I mean, Seinfeld is somewhat the exception because he's not an actor and he's just playing himself. But like I think rewatching it, I newly appreciated how great Louis-Dreyfus is. Like, she is just amazingly funny, and like is an actual really, really good actor.
Well, she's the one who's like gone on to do
she's
other
in Veep
things.
now. And then Michael Richards kind of got in trouble. That was like kind of in the proto.
Oh, that's right. That
YouTube
feels
era.
like so long ago. It was like him, and then it was also Mel Gibson. They were the kind of early. Yeah,
getting caught on tape doing something racially offensive. But but he is such an incredibly gifted physical actor, and just the way he's throwing himself around and falling over, it's just like incredible to see. And
when he works in the bagel shop, oh my goodness, the Festivus episode, everything about the Festivus episode. Yeah.
Yeah, and then Jason Alexander is really really funny as well, and I think he's not quite as good as Dreyfus, but he just like his delivery, and when you see interviews with him, you can see like that's not his voice. He like created a voice for the character.
I think I've ever seen. Oh, now I need to see an interview with him. I can't imagine him as not.
It's much more subdued and like calm. So I think the show does really hold up, and so it kind of did. The legacy continues. Everyone realizes Louis-Dreyfus is a comedic genius now. Seinfeld has his little thing where he drives around.
I find it unwatchable, unfortunately.
Drives around comedians. Yeah, I watched maybe the first season of it, but didn't get into it. But yeah, I think there was kind of like some kind of creative magic happen when you got these people together with Larry David and the other writers. So yeah, if you have the chance, if you're in the U.S., try rewatching it because it does hold up. I mean, do you think like is there anything that's kind of like matched the level of creative performance in terms of like a comedy or just funniness or accomplishment or anything? Yeah. I can't really think of anything since then.
Well, I can definitely we'll get my whole like I've watched a lot of TV, but so I mean the obvious for me would be Fawlty Towers as like the other show that really sort of captures these kind of like universal human failings in this really timeless way. And I mean, I think in terms of Seinfeld, like I've watched it with my husband who's from Belgium and did not grow up even in an English speaking place. And like other European people I know will like get it, even though, cause I would always wonder, like, do I just think this is so brilliant because it just seems familiar to me because it happens to be set, sort of in New York, although in this kind of weird sitcom version of New York that doesn't always quite make sense.
Right, where they all have cars.
Right, where they all have cars, and then this kind of a separate topic where they're Jewish but not Jewish, which is its own whole weird thing.
Right.
But in terms of other shows, I mean, absolutely fabulous, I think. It's really mainly British shows I think of as like that would be kind of similar in terms of getting like that same kind of human failing quality. So like Absolutely Fabulous does a kind of women's version of this that I think much more gets at like sort of female specific George Costanza-ness, if that makes sense. Like, although I guess that it might have some of it been earlier than Seinfeld, or well, certainly not all of it because there was just an Absolutely Fabulous movie. But like Adina Monsoon as like a kind of super flawed, ridiculous character. Like Elaine is in Seinfeld, but like I don't think whenever they give her a line that's like the woman's perspective on something, I'm often thinking like that doesn't make any sense. But I mean, it'll still be funny. I don't like the show less for this, but yeah, I'd say like Absolutely Fabulous. But Absolutely Fabulous isn't as like it's not like as good, and it has so many more sort of weak spots. Like the first few seasons were really good, but yeah. And in terms of just being like that funny, we're like how can something be that funny? I mean, I guess The Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt I think is very funny, but not to that. Only like a few episodes are like that funny, maybe. But it's like it's the closest thing that's recent that comes to mind.
Yeah, that is a great show. I was thinking 30 Rock somewhat. Although like 30 Rock and Kimmy Schmidt are a lot like zanier than Seinfeld. And exists more like a cartoon universe where, like a fish could start talking or something and it just keeps on going. Whereas Seinfeld, at least Seinfeld became more surreal and strange in the later seasons, especially after David left he left after season 7, I think. So they did like the backwards episode and stuff like that. But, it was mostly grounded in realism in that they were dealing with like actual human problems, like a parking space or, or something.
Yeah.
So yeah, nothing I've seen since then has done that exactly. Like The Office obviously like had a lot of to do with like mundane reality, but that had a very different tonal feel to it and was more like, you know, characters who you were rooting for instead of like these.
Well, The
awful
Office,
characters.
I think, is really different in terms of where Jim and Pam would like look, or was it just Jim would like look at the camera, and you're supposed to, like, the audience is supposed to identify with the kind of, I don't want to say cool, but the sort of normal people in the office, you know, and think of Michael. I have not watched the show in a while.
Yeah, Michael.
As the kind of like, as ridiculous, whereas I feel like Seinfeld asks the audience to identify with the ridiculousness, and Jerry's just kind of in the middle of it, but I don't know that you're really supposed to identify with Jerry. He's just kind of like, you know, the comedic straight man, but I don't know. I'm not sure if it's quite the same. Jerry's not looking at the camera, not literally, and not even like sort of
right.
general
So
sense.
there's I mean, one change since Seinfeld is most of the sitcoms now are like the single camera format, not, and where Seinfeld was before a live studio audience,
Right.
And so that's different, and and The Office established that kind of like documentary style, and most shows like Brooklyn Nine-Nine is something I'm watching right now because on Hulu, and that like it basically plays like a sitcom from the 90s where like zany things are happening and all the characters are kooky, but it is like there's no studio audience. It's like filmed, like a drama would be. So that's
or also the Mindy Project. That's reminding me though, The Office. The Mindy Project's maybe a little more Seinfeldish.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that because Mindy, at least in the beginning, I kind of stopped watching it, but Mindy was a real jerk, and
Yes.
yeah, kept on doing really awful things where you weren't supposed to root for her. Okay, do you want to maybe just for 10 minutes talk about canceling and uncanceling?
Yes. Sounds good.
Okay, and then we'll wrap it up. So yeah, I was just thinking like, you know, there are all these people out there who are opposed to the social justice warriors and think that those social justice warriors go around canceling people at the drop of a hat if they say the wrong word or are insensitive culturally or racially or on some like gender way. Then, you know, they'll say you are canceled, like get out of here. And so it kind of, you know, I guess it was kind of going on before Me Too, but once that broke, I think that like kind of accelerated it, where it was like for a while, like every other day, some powerful man was being exposed for his, sexual transgressions, and it was like, well, this one's canceled. Louis C.K. is canceled.
Barbara Streisand has been canceled because
Well,
there's canceled by association now.
Right,
also.
Barbara Streisand stood up for,
or not by association, but like there's canceled for having a bad take on the thing, not just for having done the thing.
Right, so that's a second level cancellation, I guess. Yeah, so Barbara Streisand defended her good friend, the late Michael Jackson,
Right.
even after this documentary came out that I did not see, that I guess established very clearly that Michael Jackson was a pedophile who groomed children to have sex with them. And Barbara Streisand was like,
right.
He was
so
a
that
great guy.
basically that he had been, I had always heard the rumor that he was a child molester and rapist, but I have not seen this documentary either. But right, like you say, it seems like it was pretty definitive. And yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any case, I don't think there's any interpretation where Barbara Streisand's take on this was reasonable. I guess the question is, what do you do with that? And like, do you say never mind about Barbara Streisand as a human being, as a career? Is it like now you can't listen to Barbara Streisand albums as one does apparently? I'll have to put all my Barbara Streisand records in the garbage.
yeah. I'm continuing the Barbara Streisand record boycott that I've been sticking to for the past couple decades. Okay, so so then there's people mostly on the right who are like, we're all like on, we all have to like tiptoe around and
the eggshells.
Yeah, we're on eggshells. Yeah. We're afraid. Everyone's afraid of being canceled. One wrong word will get you canceled. And I was thinking that like, so there's people who it's been exposed are guilty of monstrous crimes. So that's like Bill Cosby, Michael Jackson, Harvey Weinstein, allegedly. So when
Kevin Spacey, apparently.
Yeah, Kevin Spacey probably, although he made a weird video trying to do some kind of comeback thing, if you remember a couple months ago. So there's people like that who are guilty of serious crimes and or transgressions where it's like their career is probably over, or they go to jail, like Cosby is in jail. But after that, it's kind of like, okay, can you actually be canceled if you don't want to be canceled? Is there no cancellation but self-cancellation is, I guess, the way I was thinking of it. And look at the three men who are at the top of Virginia state government. The governor was seemingly posing in either a Klan hood or blackface, and can't remember which. Or maybe he said it was the blackface, not the Klan hood. But anyway, he did something pretty racist when he was a medical student, and then it came out that there were multiple women accusing his lieutenant governor of having sexually assaulted them or raped them. And it came out that the attorney general also, I think actually he admitted himself that he wore blackface at some point, like in the 80s when he was in college.
I think I missed that whole step of it, but yes.
Yeah, so there were three separate guys, two blackface accusations, I think, which they admitted to, and one sexual assault. One was accused of sexual assault multiple times, which he has denied. None of these guys resigned. Right. And it was for a couple days there. It was like, how can Ralph Northam hold on? Like, all he did was just nothing, and he held on perfectly fine. So Virginia is weird because the governors have a one-term term limit, so he can't get elected governor again. Probably he's not going to be elected to anything else.
Right. Who knows? Depends where the country goes.
Exactly, but who knows?
Yeah. And
the guy who has multiple women accusing him of rape is still the attorney general. So if you don't give in to like the crowd or the mob or however you want to characterize it, like you can probably hang on because the life cycle of these stories is such that there's another outrage coming down the pike. Within a week, we'll be talking about something else. Within a month, we'll have totally forgotten about it. It's been, I think, 2 months since the Ralph Northam thing. Is anyone still are people parade with signs outside the governor's mansion in Virginia saying resign now? I don't think so.
Well, I look out the window in Toronto. I'm not sure, but yeah, no, I see what you're saying. I think, I think this also gets back to this notion of social media and bubbles, because I think there's a way that people on the left, and I shouldn't say that progressives, the ones who will be deemed social justice warriors, communicate on social media that gives a rhetorical impression of having power that they just often don't have. So I think I brought this up also in the podcast with Kat, but where there was somebody who is, I think, a professor in Canada said something about, it was like a tweet that was something like, Canadian academics who write for Quillette, the publication that's sort of contrarian, whatever, who write for Quillette, we see you, we know who you are. And then people were tweeting something about lists of the people that they were going to make lists. The question is, do these people have any power who are saying this? And I think sometimes yes, sometimes no, but that I think I'm obsessed with this idea that there being something called I call it social justice ease. It's not very good. It makes more sense when I write it down, I guess.
You mean
but there's
lingo.
A social, there's a way that people talk, and they can make you feel when they talk to you in this way like they're very powerful, and they can kind of turn you in, make you walk on these kind of eggshells, but they don't necessarily actually have power in society, if that makes sense. They don't necessarily control anything. And I think if you exit whichever bubble, there's this wide world in which Trump is president. You know what I mean? And
talk about avoiding cancellation.
Well, exactly.
Donald J. Trump.
In which it's possible to be quite problematic and sort of celebrated for that. So it just depends you can also just kind of change who your audience is. You know what I mean? Maybe Louis C.K. is done in terms of that role he had when I first learned about him this is going to make me seem very cool, was listening to a Fresh Air podcast where Terry Gross was interviewing him. This was many years ago. I was on a bus in Paris listening to this podcast and who's this Louis C.K.? And it was all about how he is so good at understanding his own privilege or whatever and conveying that to audiences. I think he's done in that role, but is he done? Not necessarily.
No, he's not done because there's another audience out there which
Right.
is making fun of the privileged little college students who
Right.
need a safe space and a trigger warning.
Exactly. So
And
then
Aziz
he's got other
Ansari
people.
is touring again. His whether he was guilty of any actual violation is still being debated. But okay,
Right. Or
he took
whether
a
he
year
had
off.
his own privacy violated is another whole possibility there.
Right.
Yeah.
So he basically took a year off from being like a touring comedian or whatever else he was doing. But he's back on tour, and now he tells jokes making fun of college students. And the leaked set that Louis C.K. Performed, which it seemed like he was decided that he was gonna turn his satire against the social justice warriors. He's making fun of students who had survived a mass shooting at their school and
Right.
and things like that. So there's an audience for that too. This is a big country, and he could probably have some other kind of career doing that. And yeah, it's just like if you lay low, maybe you have to make some changes. You're not permanently canceled. Like,
Well, you can make changes in either direction is the thing. Like it might be more lucrative to make changes where you're no longer striving to seem virtuous, then you go more the sort of Seinfeld, like not Seinfeld the man, Seinfeld the show route, where you're just leaning into the awfulness and making the comedy from that. I mean, what I think is interesting though with this whole issue of the cancellation and the eggshells and all that is how the people you hear the most from about how they've been silenced are people who have made careers out of being kind of martyrs.
If we hear from them about being silenced,
right,
therefore they have not been silenced.
But I feel like this gets tricky because the fact is there are people who are, and I don't think that this is like particularly debatable, there are people who are worried that if they say the wrong thing, they'll be fired from a job. I don't think and I don't think it's necessarily just in one direction politically. I think in the actual world not that Twitter isn't real in its own way, but, if you work in a small office and you say things your boss doesn't like, you could get fired. And it's not like that's like, I think that's why there's such an obsession with like professors' free speech, because these are the only people who could plausibly imagine they would have it at work.
Because if they have tenure, they can't be fired.
Right. But I mean, I think it gets confusing where somebody like another person who I think has some YouTube is this Jordan Peterson fellow.
I've heard the name, not super familiar.
My fellow Torontonian, waving. Yeah. Somebody like that. On the one hand, it seems absurd. Like, are people like this being silenced? Obviously, you go on YouTube and no matter how many Britcom reruns you use it for, it's still showing you Jordan Peterson clips.
Like in the recommendations, you mean? Like
in the recommendations, yeah. Exactly. Yeah. You don't have to click on it for it to show you this. So, believe me. But the question is, though, are people like this speaking for a kind of silenced, I don't want to say majority, but like, are they speaking for some kind of, for real people who don't have a platform? But I think what gets very tricky with these conversations is that often the right to speak out gets wrapped up in these kind of cult of personality around people who've turned themselves into martyrs. We don't have time for me to go into how this totally also happened in 1840s France, but just know that it did. Just know that it did. That's all I ask.
Okay, so it's maybe more the human condition than
well, that dynamic is certainly that dynamic. I think of like claiming that you were silenced as a kind of power move is not new, but it's certainly with social media become much more of a thing.
Yeah, and 30 years ago, if you were some kind of public figure, who transgressed in some way, it seemed like the media as a whole could basically silence you because they would say, "We're not putting you on TV anymore. We're not your articles will not be included in various publications or whatever. But now, as we all know, you can do it yourself, and you really have to violate a lot of boundaries to get banned from the social media networks. Like it took years and years and years for them to kick Alex Jones off of these various channels. So just keep on doing your thing, and and you can even monetize it.
I wanted to ask you though, just about your arguments about this, about the self-cancellation. So what do you make of that though? Like the new phenomenon of like YA authors or whoever like self-canceling.
Yeah. So that's the ones where it's like most, like literal. If the people, I guess it's happened twice, in the past couple months of these, like debut authors in YA literature, withdrawing their books from publication. Unclear if it's like for some period of time or permanently. And I mean, yeah, that's like if they had just like written it out, then the book would have been published. Because the YA thing is super weird, because the people who truly are incensed about it are like 36, adults scattered across the country who have like 4,000 Twitter followers each, and the idea that this is like some sort of groundswell of public opinion against any particular book is crazy.
I find the whole power dynamic aspect of this. So I'm not part of that world at all, but I've read a bit about the controversies, and it seems like, I guess it has something to do with if they get bad reviews on Goodreads, but it seems like the good reviews could cancel it out. I cancel it, whatever. I guess I don't, just as a writer, I can't imagine self-canceling. I think I have too much ego for that. If I'd written a whole novel, I would not be like, never mind. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, it's strange. And I guess it has to do with the authors themselves identifying as part of the community, and like articles are written about the second guy, whose name I can't remember, was kind of a like part of the like, squad of people who go after other authors for writing things.
And was also, I think, a sensitivity reader, which added another whole...
Right, and the fact that the two people who have withdrawn their novels one was, I think I have this right, one was Chinese American, and one was African American. It's kind of like the people who have some investment in the community are more likely to self-cancel, whereas the people who are like just out to make a buck or whatever, who are just like, no, this is going through no matter what, they get to make some money, whereas the other people are losing out on the sales. So I mean, I guess I don't see that as a wise financial, what do I know about how people make money writing, but I don't see that as like a wise financial strategy. I feel like probably not self-canceling would be more lucrative, but what do I know? Right. So yeah, I feel it's like, offering some sort of like, weird advice to someone who is in the middle, who's people are trying to cancel. Like, you probably did something that offended them in some way. Like, you could try apologizing, but you don't have, unless you are like, I'm going to go live in the monastery, or I'm withdrawing from public life indefinitely, then, 2 or 3 months later.
It's all that gets praised, I think, though, is the self-cancellation, because I think whenever people apologize, then certainly if it's on Twitter, the first reply will be like, you suck. You know what I mean? Like, and it just kind of, I think the only thing that seems to get that was really good of you kind of Twitter response, at least, is like a real, like, how dare I have, like taken up space in this world with
like shaving your head and donning like sackcloth and ashes to like penitently walk somewhere. Exactly. That's what they want. And then, I don't know, like, they'll forget about you the next day because there'll be another outrage. It's not like they're going to be like inviting you into their homes to like nurse you back to health, metaphorically or something.
I think it happens. I think there's similar sort of outrages on the left and right. I mean, I think about like the outrage at like 2 writers who are teaching, like adjunct teaching at NYU in the journalism school. And this got similar, like, I guess, I mean, I had whatever thoughts on, like, I guess maybe one of them or the other, but like, it just seemed like also just not a big deal in the grand scheme of things. But it also got all this outrage because I think it had to do with it was some sort of incident where people on the right, I think, or somewhat also not on the right, thought should have been kind of canceled. And how dare this person kind of like surface again and not have been canceled, when it was like, what had they surfaced to do? Well, it was to adjunct teach a class for like a few $1,000s, which, I mean, like, should people not earn money and like completely disappear? Like, I don't know. The stakes are sometimes a little warped like that.
Yeah, and I know the two people you're talking about, I think, are Talia Lavin, if I'm pronouncing that right, and Lauren Duca.
And Lauren Duca, right.
And one of them was referred to on like Laura Ingram's show as like a journo terrorist or something like that. So
my whole family is
okay. So that means we've gone very long.
I think so. I see a stroller, a poodle, and not just those two. Also my husband. So
okay. So why don't we? That's a good. That's a good sign.
With that? Okay, I think they've all made it through. I assume the baby is in the stroller. Okay.
Okay, so that's a good sign that we should probably wrap it up there then.
So
thanks so much for coming on finally. I think we've been talking about Dreyfus for a while. So
for ages, yes.
So
well, thank you so much. This was a joy.
Oh, that's great. So watch Feminine Chaos. If you don't, you're missing out. So thank you, Phoebe, and thanks to our viewers and listeners.
Sorry. All right. Thank you so much.